Hey everyone. Tonight's story drifts into the hidden corners of history, where queens lived surrounded by splendor yet sometimes reached toward forbidden shadows. These are tales woven from rumor, chronicler's ink, and the quiet echo of palace walls, stories of longing, secrecy, and the weight of crowns. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim the lights, maybe let a soft fan or gentle background hum carry you into the right atmosphere. And if you haven't already, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you don't miss our next slow journey through forgotten history. Now, as you breathe a little slower and let the noise of the day fade away, imagine the silent corridors of palaces, the flicker of torches against stone, and the way footsteps would echo in chambers designed for both grandeur and secrecy. In these spaces, queens stood in the light of ceremony, yet shadows always lingered nearby. So, let us begin. There is a certain stillness to palaces that no amount of movement can ever quite erase. Even when filled with servants, courtiers, musicians and soldiers, their stone walls hold on to silence in a way that seems almost intentional. The echo of footsteps does not break this silence but deepens it, stretching the sound until it dissolves into the cavernous distance of vaulted ceilings and long corridors. This was the world that queens inhabited, an architectural stage built both to display them as symbols of sovereignty and to conceal them behind carefully controlled layers of protocol. To walk into a medieval or early modern palace was to step into a paradox. Everything was designed to impress: gilded ceilings, elaborate mosaics, marbled floors polished to a sheen, heavy curtains embroidered with symbols of dynasties. Yet behind this outward splendor lay chambers and passages intended not for display but for withdrawal, a hidden geography of privacy. In these spaces, queens lived their lives under the dual weight of being perpetually seen and carefully hidden. The throne room and chapel were stages upon which their piety and loyalty were enacted. The private chambers, by contrast, were hushed sanctuaries where eyes were still present but softer, less direct, belonging to ladies-in-waiting, attendants and guards who observed but seldom spoke. It was in such thresholds, half public, half private, that the first whispers of rumor often began. A queen standing at the edge of a great hall might exchange a glance too long with a courtier, or her footsteps might be traced too often toward a secluded gallery where others were known to pass. These movements, innocent in themselves, became the fertile ground upon which suspicion could grow. For in courts where power was fragile, any suggestion that a queen might turn her affections towards someone outside the king was both scandalous and politically dangerous. The architecture of palaces shaped these perceptions. Long corridors created natural spaces for fleeting encounters. Gardens with winding paths offered seclusion that was at once innocent and suggestive. Even the ritual of a queen's daily routine, the procession from her chambers to chapel, the formal meals, the audiences with ambassadors, provided moments where her gestures could be scrutinized and interpreted. The palaces themselves, with their layers of openness and concealment, invited rumor simply by existing as both fortress and stage. To understand the weight of this atmosphere, one must imagine the rhythm of life inside these vast residences. The queen's day began early, often with attendants entering her bedchamber at dawn. Curtains would be drawn back to let in the pale light, and water would be brought for washing. Breakfast was rarely private. Her ladies would already be in attendance, and messages or petitions might be read aloud. From the first waking moment, she was never alone. The bedchamber itself, that most intimate of spaces, was shared, at least in part, with others whose presence blurred the line between privacy and surveillance. After morning prayers, the queen moved through a sequence of duties: attending mass, receiving visitors, engaging in embroidery, or reading, under the watchful eyes of attendants, overseeing the management of her household. At meals, she sat in hierarchical arrangements that displayed not intimacy but rank. Even relaxation was formalized. To stroll in a garden, to listen to music, to play cards, all of these moments took place in company, under observation. The few spaces where she might step aside for quiet were never entirely free of notice, for every chamber and corridor of a palace belonged to someone's awareness. It was this delicate balance, of being simultaneously enclosed and exposed, that made palaces such fertile ground for whispers of forbidden shadows. A queen who paused too long at a window while watching soldiers train in the courtyard, or who seemed particularly gracious toward a visiting envoy, could spark speculation. A smile noted by one attendant became an anecdote repeated by another, until the court itself began to murmur. In a world where politics thrived on gossip as much as on treaties, these murmurs carried weight. They were recorded in letters, whispered to ambassadors, and even noted in chronicles that would shape the reputation of queens for centuries. The threshold of the palace was therefore not just a physical boundary, but a symbolic one. To step into a queen's presence was to enter a space where appearances mattered more than substance, and where the smallest gestures could be magnified into accusations. The silence of the palace halls was deceptive. Beneath it flowed an undercurrent of constant observation, interpretation, and speculation. We might imagine the late evening, when the formal duties of the day were completed, and the palace settled into a quieter rhythm. Torches flickered against stone walls, servants moved softly to complete their last tasks, and music from distant chambers drifted faintly before fading into stillness. The queen, surrounded by her ladies, retired to her bedchamber, yet even here the silence was never complete. Doors creaked softly as guards shifted their watch. Whispers passed between attendants settling into their own pallets nearby, and the heavy weight of expectation lingered in the air. The palace itself seemed to listen, its walls bearing witness to every movement. This silence, paradoxically full of sound, was the atmosphere in which rumors were born. It was not necessary for a queen to act upon any desire for suspicion to grow. The palace itself supplied the stage and courtiers supplied the interpretation. The stillness of these grand residences was not restful but charged, a quiet that demanded meaning, and within that demand, the figure of the queen stood always on the threshold, both sovereign and subject, visible and hidden, luminous and shadowed. Thus, before the stories of particular queens and their whispered affairs unfold, it is important to dwell for a moment on this threshold itself. For the architecture of palaces, the rhythm of their days, and the constant presence of watchful eyes created the environment in which shadows could become dangerous. The stillness of palatial chambers was not emptiness but possibility, a silence heavy with meaning, where the line between loyalty and betrayal could be traced by nothing more than a glance, a gesture, or a pause too long in the wrong corridor. Ceremony in the life of a queen was both armor and cage. It clothed her in grandeur, shaping her into a living emblem of power, piety, and continuity. Yet beneath its layers, she often stood alone, her individuality swallowed by the endless repetition of ritual. A queen was not merely a person, but a presence, her every step, gesture, and expression carefully prescribed by traditions older than herself. It was through these carefully choreographed rituals that she was elevated above her subjects, but it was also through them that she became isolated, gazed upon yet never truly seen. The rituals began the moment she entered her role. A royal wedding was not simply a union, but a spectacle, a carefully staged performance in which alliances between kingdoms were sealed before the eyes of courtiers, clergy, and foreign ambassadors. Every detail, from the embroidery on her gown to the order in which she processed down the aisle, was meant to signify dynastic strength and divine sanction. For the queen herself, however, the weight of such ceremony often marked the first moment of her solitude. She was lifted into a role that demanded her obedience not to her husband alone, but to an entire structure of power, ritual, and gaze. Within the palace, the ceremonies never ceased. Daily mass was not simply a devotion but a display of piety, watched by courtiers who whispered if she failed to bow deeply enough, or if her eyes strayed during prayers. Meals, too, became stages. Queens ate in public, seated beneath canopies, while attendants carried dishes in elaborate sequences that underscored hierarchy rather than appetite. Even the act of drinking water or breaking bread became charged with meaning, for every gesture was observed and remembered. This constant visibility created a paradoxical loneliness. A queen might be surrounded by dozens, even hundreds of people throughout her day, yet remain profoundly alone. Her closest attendants were not companions in the modern sense but watchers, bound by duty to observe and record, rather than to confide or comfort. Even moments of supposed intimacy, playing cards with ladies in waiting, strolling through gardens, listening to music, carried with them the unspoken awareness that she was always being seen. It was within this unyielding framework of ceremony that secrecy found its subtle pathways. The very rituals that isolated queens also created predictable rhythms, patterns that could be bent or exploited. A queen's daily procession to chapel meant she would always pass the same corridors, encounter the same guards, and nod to the same courtiers. A glance held a second longer than courtesy required might go unnoticed by most, but for those attuned to such gestures, it spoke volumes. The choreography of ritual became a silent language through which desire and intrigue could move, hidden beneath layers of formality. The gaze of the court amplified these possibilities. Ambassadors stationed in foreign lands wrote dispatches not only about treaties and wars, but about the behavior of queens who they smiled at, how they dressed, whether they seemed restless or melancholy. Chroniclers, many of them monks or clerics, often recorded these observations with a blend of fact and speculation, blurring the line between truth and rumor. A queen's glance at a knight during a tournament might become, in the retelling, the seed of a suspected affair. Her act of gifting a favor, a ribbon, a token, a gesture of encouragement, might later be written as a sign of passion, whether or not she intended it. Behind the veils of ceremony, loneliness deepened. A queen's marriage was rarely born of affection, it was a political arrangement, designed to unite dynasties and secure heirs. Kings, often occupied with war, hunting, or their own mistresses, might offer little companionship. The queen, meanwhile, remained tethered to her duties, surrounded by attendants but cut off from genuine intimacy. It is within this space, gilded, ceremonial, yet hollow, that the shadows of forbidden desire crept most quietly. The architecture of ceremony itself allowed for secrecy to exist in plain sight. During banquets, when halls filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of goblets, the queen could exchange a subtle glance across the room without it appearing unusual. At court dances, where partners changed in elaborate sequences, the briefest touch of a hand might carry a weight of meaning invisible to others. Even during solemn religious rituals, when all eyes were cast downward in prayer, moments of fleeting connection could be hidden beneath the veil of piety. These were not necessarily grand affairs, but small, almost imperceptible gestures, born from the natural human longing for recognition and warmth. Yet within the charged atmosphere of the court, where gossip was currency and loyalty was tested daily, such gestures became magnified. A smile was never just a smile, a touch was never simply a touch. Desire lived in the margins of ceremony, in the interstices between duty and longing, in the silent spaces created by the very grandeur that kept queens apart. The veils of ceremony also extended to how queens themselves were remembered. Chroniclers often depicted them less as individuals and more as archetypes, the virtuous mother, the scheming temptress, the tragic victim. Their inner lives were obscured behind ceremonial images, their humanity hidden beneath allegory and symbol. This erasure only deepened the sense that queens moved through life as shadows of themselves, always present yet never fully revealed. To imagine the full weight of this existence is to see a queen seated beneath a canopy at a feast, her face lit by torchlight, jewels glittering at her neck. Around her, courtiers laugh, musicians play, servants hurry with platters of food. She smiles, she nods, she raises her cup. To the assembled crowd, she is the embodiment of majesty, radiant and untouchable. Yet within her mind, the clamor may fade into silence, the rituals may feel endless, and the gaze of hundreds may only sharpen her sense of solitude. And it is here, in this lonely grandeur, that the first stirrings of secrecy take root. The palace is filled with people, but few see her as she truly is. Ceremony wraps her in veils of expectation, but desire, subtle, forbidden, and unspoken, slips quietly through the gaps. It does not need grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It lives in the smallest of moments, hidden beneath the gaze of those who believe they see everything, and yet perceive nothing at all. In the intricate world of the royal court, the queen was surrounded not only by grandeur, but by people, a ceaseless tide of attendants, guards, advisors, musicians, tutors, and foreign emissaries. Each had a role, each was bound by duty, and yet their presence shaped the queen's daily existence more than the distant power of kings. These figures lingered at the edges of her life, shadows in her chambers and corridors, constant and silent, both guardians and potential threats. In their closeness lay a dangerous paradox. They were always near enough to be seen, but never meant to be touched. The queen's attendants were among the most constant of these shadows. Ladies in waiting, drawn from noble families, lived in her immediate orbit. They dressed her, prayed beside her, played games with her, and shared in the most intimate rhythms of daily life. Yet their loyalty was seldom entirely personal. Each lady carried with her the interests of her family, whose fortunes rose or fell with proximity to the queen. Whispers spoken in the privacy of a bedchamber could easily find their way to ambitious fathers or brothers, transformed into weapons of influence. Still, it was among these women that the queen sometimes found comfort, companionship, and in rare cases, the faint stirrings of something deeper, affection that blurred the line between friendship and desire, closeness that fed suspicion even if nothing passed between them. If the ladies were companions bound by noble birth, the guards were figures of another kind, men of discipline, strength, and silence. Stationed at doors, posted along corridors, they were there to keep danger out and secrecy in. Their presence was physical, imposing, and constant. A queen passed them daily, when she went to chapel, when she strolled the gardens, when she retired for the night. Unlike courtiers who swirled in politics and ambition, guards existed on the threshold, half invisible, yet deeply present. The silent steadiness of a gaze, the soft clink of armor, the subtle bow of the head, all these gestures carried weight. For some queens, these men embodied what the rituals of courtly life denied: strength without ceremony, presence without pretense. It was not necessary for words to be spoken. Temptation could arise from nothing more than repetition. The same face met every day, the same silent loyalty embodied in the same figure who stood watch, unmoving, while the rest of the court shifted like tides. Tutors and scholars formed yet another kind of shadow. Many queens were educated beyond the expectations of their time, taught languages, literature, theology, or philosophy. Tutors entered the royal household, not as companions but as instructors, bringing with them knowledge that opened wider worlds beyond the confines of palaces. A queen who studied Latin or scripture with a learned man might find in him not only intellectual companionship, but also a sense of recognition that was rare within the rigid rituals of court. The intimacy of shared learning, reading aloud, writing letters, debating interpretations, could foster a closeness that was easily misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented. Knowledge, after all, was power, and the queen who sought it was often feared as much for her mind as for her potential desires. Foreign emissaries too drifted at the edges of queens' lives, bringing with them the allure of distant lands. Ambassadors and envoys arrived, bearing letters, gifts, and treaties, and in their presence the queen embodied not only her own identity, but that of her entire kingdom. She spoke with them, entertained them, exchanged polite gestures under the gaze of the court. These men carried themselves differently from courtiers. They were strangers, outsiders, their manner shaped by other courts, other customs. To converse with them was to glimpse a world beyond the palace walls, a reminder that life existed outside the gilded cage of ritual. To some queens, this air of foreignness held a subtle charm, a temptation not of passion alone but of escape, the promise of lives untouched by the suffocating watchfulness of their own courts. It is important to note that for many queens, these shadows were never more than figures of presence. Yet in the climate of suspicion that surrounded royal women, the mere existence of closeness was enough to spark whispers. A queen speaking at length with her tutor became, in rumor, a queen seduced by knowledge and by the man who imparted it. A queen pausing too long before a guard's post became, in courtly imagination, a queen enthralled by forbidden strength. A gift accepted from an emissary became, in the language of gossip, a token of intimacy. The nature of these shadows was not only in their physical presence, but in the way others perceived them. The court was a machine of observation, its gears turned by the eyes and tongues of those who watched. Servants noticed small gestures, courtiers exaggerated them, chroniclers recorded them, often with moral judgments attached. The queen's own intentions mattered less than the interpretations imposed upon her. Shadows became forbidden not because they always carried transgression, but because the possibility of transgression was itself intolerable. We must also consider how power shaped this dynamic. Queens, though crowned, were often powerless in the face of suspicion. A king's infidelities might be tolerated or ignored, explained as natural. A queen's faintest association with another man could be cast as treason, a betrayal not only of her husband but of the dynasty itself. The stakes were impossibly high. Whispers could lead to confinement, annulment, or execution. Yet the shadows never vanished. They lingered, unavoidable, woven into the very structure of life at court. If one were to walk through the palace in the quiet hours of night, the shadows would be most visible. Guards standing motionless at their posts, attendants whispering by candlelight, tutors' books stacked neatly in study chambers, emissaries housed in guest apartments waiting for their next audience. All were part of the queen's world, each bound to her orbit, each close enough to touch yet impossibly distant. They were figures defined by duty, and yet through the lens of rumor and desire, they became something more: silent temptations, forbidden presences, shadows that followed her through every corridor. The forbidden shadows were therefore not extraordinary figures, but ordinary ones made extraordinary by their closeness to the queen. They were ever present but untouchable, ordinary men and women transformed by the gaze of a court into symbols of desire, secrecy, and danger. And as history would show, it was often less the shadows themselves than the stories told about them that would determine a queen's fate. The medieval court was a place where silence carried weight, and whispers traveled farther than proclamations. Queens moved within its carefully ordered chambers, embodying majesty and virtue, yet their lives were often remembered less for the treaties they helped secure or the dynasties they extended, and more for the rumors that clung to their names. Among the most enduring examples are Eleanor of Aquitaine and Isabella of France, queens whose lives unfolded in the full glare of history, but whose reputations were shadowed by the suggestion of forbidden intimacy. Eleanor of Aquitaine, born in 1122, inherited one of the largest and most desirable domains in Europe. Intelligent, cultured, and fiercely independent, she first married Louis VII of France, and later, after their annulment, Henry II of England. As queen consort in two of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, Eleanor's political influence was undeniable. Yet alongside chronicles of her statesmanship and patronage of the arts, there emerged a murmur that she was too free, too bold, too close to the shadows that propriety forbade. During her marriage to Louis, Eleanor was accused of being overly familiar with her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch. When she accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, the pair spent time together in Antioch, discussing strategy and politics. Chroniclers, often wary of women who asserted themselves in matters of war, hinted at something more, suggesting impropriety where perhaps there was only companionship and shared ambition. The suspicion was enough to poison her marriage with Louis, who felt both betrayed and undermined. No evidence survives of an affair, yet the whisper lingered. Eleanor was painted as a woman whose affections strayed beyond her husband, whose independence blurred into scandal. Later, as Queen of England, Eleanor became entangled in the turbulence of Henry II's reign and the rebellion of her sons. Here again, her assertiveness fed into rumor. Some claimed she encouraged her son's defiance because of broken trust with Henry, who was known for his infidelities. Others whispered that Eleanor herself had lovers, courtiers, or knights who moved within her orbit. Chroniclers, who opposed her, painted her as dangerously passionate, a woman whose alliances extended beyond the political. The truth is elusive, for the records we have are steeped in bias, but the whisper of forbidden lovers became part of Eleanor's legend, a shadow that clung to her image as both queen and mother. If Eleanor's reputation was shaped by rumor, Isabella of France's was consumed by it. Born around 1295, Isabella was married to Edward II of England, a king whose reign was troubled by conflict and division. Edward's close relationships with his male favourites, first Piers Gaveston, later Hugh Despenser the Younger, alienated many nobles, and left Isabella sidelined. In the absence of a traditional bond between king and queen, suspicion quickly turned toward Isabella herself. Isabella eventually formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English nobleman exiled to France. Their association became one of the most infamous whispers of the medieval age. Chroniclers, and later historians alike, suggested that Isabella and Mortimer were lovers, their intimacy bound up with their political partnership. Together they returned to England in 1326, raised an army, deposed Edward II, and installed Isabella's young son Edward III on the throne. Edward II died shortly after, under circumstances that remain shrouded in mystery. Some accounts claimed he was murdered in secret, others that he died in captivity. For many, Isabella's supposed intimacy with Mortimer was proof of her betrayal, an affair that extended beyond passion into treason. What is striking in Isabella's case is how quickly her political alliance was interpreted through the lens of forbidden desire. It was unthinkable, for many contemporaries, that a woman could exercise such decisive power without the influence of a man beside her. The notion of a queen acting independently was not considered. Thus, her partnership with Mortimer had to be explained as an affair with lust rather than strategy driving events. Whether the intimacy was real or imagined mattered less than the perception. Isabella became immortalized as the she-wolf of France, her reputation overshadowed by whispers of shadowed passion and ruthless ambition. Both Eleanor and Isabella demonstrate the peril queens faced when their lives intersected with powerful men beyond their husbands. Proximity bred suspicion, independence magnified it. A queen who merely conversed with her uncle or formed an alliance with a nobleman risked having her name bound forever to rumors of forbidden lovers. In a world where dynasties balanced on fragile foundations, where legitimacy was everything, even the faintest suggestion of infidelity could destabilize kingdoms. These whispers reveal less about the actual desires of queens than they do about the anxieties of medieval society. Women who stepped beyond the quiet role of consort, who spoke too freely, who strategized too boldly, who sought companionship beyond the king, were reimagined as dangerous, their influence explained through the language of forbidden shadows. A rumor, once recorded by a chronicler, gained the weight of permanence, echoing through centuries until queens became as much symbols of scandal as of sovereignty. And so, in the stillness of medieval palaces, the whispers grew. Eleanor, remembered for her intellect and patronage of troubadours, carried the shadow of Antioch. Isabella, remembered for her overthrow of a king, carried the shadow of Mortimer. The truth of their desires remains hidden, perhaps forever, behind the veils of time. What endures is the danger of association itself, the way queens were judged not only for their actions but for the shadows others claimed to see at their side. To cross from the echoing stone chambers of medieval Europe into the courts of Persia, the Mughal Empire, or the Ottoman Sultanate, is to enter a world where the language of power was spoken not in Gothic arches but in mosaics, courtyards and silken curtains. Here too, queens and consorts lived within layers of visibility and secrecy, enshrined by ceremony, yet shadowed by the whispers of desire. If Europe remembered its queens for glances toward courtiers or alliances with noblemen, the East preserved its own narratives of royal women, who, surrounded by grandeur and guarded by walls, sometimes strayed into shadows that were both alluring and perilous. In Persia, the Safavid court was a place of order and spectacle. Women of the royal household lived within carefully structured spaces, some accessible to visitors, others hidden. The harem was not simply a place of sensuality, as Western travelers often imagined, but a domestic and political institution, where wives, concubines, and female relatives of the Shah were organized into ranks. These women held influence, not only through their proximity to the sovereign, but through the alliances their families represented. Yet the very closeness of their lives, bound together in the intimacy of enclosed quarters, gave rise to whispers. A glance exchanged with a guard, a whispered word with a court official, a rumor carried by a servant, these were the seeds of scandal. Persian chronicles sometimes hinted at women who were accused of straying, their fates determined less by evidence than by suspicion. To be accused was to be condemned, for in the closed world of the harem, secrecy was both inevitable and dangerous. The Mughal Empire, stretching across India from the 16th century, carried this pattern into another form. The imperial harem of the Mughals was vast and elaborate, containing hundreds, sometimes thousands of women, wives, concubines, servants, musicians and guards. Yet within this seemingly impenetrable enclosure, some women rose to extraordinary power. Nur Jahan, the wife of Emperor Jahangir, effectively ruled the empire in his later years, issuing orders and even appearing on coinage. Her influence, however, sparked whispers of improper intimacy with courtiers and officials. Though no firm evidence survives, the very fact of her authority fed rumors. A queen who commanded armies must, in the imagination of her detractors, have done so not through intellect but through forbidden shadows. In a world where female power was unsettling to many, suspicion of desire became the explanation for strength. The Ottoman Empire carried the system of the harem to its most elaborate form. In the vast palaces of Istanbul, particularly Topkapi, the imperial harem was a city within a palace, guarded by eunuchs and ruled by hierarchy. At its heart were the sultan's mother, known as the Valid Sultan, and his favored consorts. These women could influence politics, diplomacy, and succession. Yet alongside their prominence came constant surveillance, for the sultan's legitimacy depended on the purity of his household. The mere suggestion of a queen or consort straying into intimacy with a man beyond the sultan was enough to invite death. Stories circulated of women drowned in the Bosphorus, executed quietly when suspicion fell upon them. Whether true or fabricated, these tales reinforced the fragility of their existence, adored, exalted, but perpetually shadowed by danger. One of the most infamous cases in Ottoman memory is that of Kozem Sultan, who lived in the 17th century and rose to become one of the most powerful women in the empire. As the mother of multiple sultans, she acted as regent and effectively ruled for decades. Chroniclers hostile to her influence whispered of her intrigues, suggesting liaisons with courtiers or excessive closeness with powerful advisors. Again, the evidence is uncertain, but the rumors reveal the pattern. Where women ruled, whispers of forbidden shadows followed. To diminish their authority, chroniclers draped them in scandal, casting their political acumen as the product of passion rather than intellect. What unites these narratives across Persia, Mughal India, and the Ottoman Empire is the interplay between enclosure and suspicion. The harem, despite its romanticized portrayal in Western imagination, was not a space of leisure, but of politics, duty, and confinement. Women lived together, bound to the rhythms of palace life, guarded against the outside world. Yet because the system depended on secrecy, rumors of broken boundaries multiplied. Eunuchs were trusted as guardians precisely because they were seen as beyond the realm of temptation. Guards and attendants, however, were always suspect, their proximity to queens and consorts transformed into danger by the imagination of the court. At night, when the palaces of Istanbul or Isfahan grew quiet, the harem would have seemed a labyrinth of silence. Courtyards lit faintly by lanterns, corridors lined with closed doors, the soft padding of attendants' feet, all of it wrapped in stillness. In such an atmosphere, even the faintest whisper could take on exaggerated meaning. A servant carrying a message too discreetly, a queen seen near a balcony when she was expected in her chamber, a smile exchanged with an official during a festival. All these became stories, repeated in secret, eventually finding their way into chronicles. The consequences of such whispers were severe. In the Mughal and Ottoman courts, accusations could mean exile, confinement, or execution, even when unproven. Rumors diminished reputations, reshaping memory. Queens who built mosques, commissioned gardens and patronized poets were remembered less for their cultural achievements and more for the suggestion that their power was born of desire. The shadow itself became stronger than reality, a legend repeated long after evidence had faded. Yet these whispers also reveal something more human. In the midst of rigid structures of power, ritual and surveillance, the queens and consorts of the East lived as women, capable of loneliness, longing, and the quiet desire for recognition beyond ceremony. Whether or not they ever acted on these emotions, the fact that their lives inspired such suspicion shows how strongly society projected its fears and fascinations onto them. The forbidden shadow was not only a presence outside their reach, but also an idea carried within the minds of those who watched them. Thus, the stories of Persian, Mughal and Ottoman queens remind us that the nature of suspicion was universal. Across continents, queens stood as symbols of dynasties, yet lived in spaces where their humanity was closely policed. To be powerful was to invite whispers, to be lonely was to risk them, and to be remembered was to be shadowed forever by the suggestion of forbidden desire. The rumor of a queen's shadowed intimacy might begin as a glance observed by a servant, or a word exchanged in a corridor, but it was the chronicler who gave it longevity. In the medieval and early modern world, chroniclers, court historians, monks and foreign ambassadors acted as both witnesses and interpreters of events. Their writings survive long after the moment has passed, carrying into the present a version of history that is as much shaped by bias and invention as by fact. For queens accused of straying into forbidden shadows, the watchful eyes of these writers determined whether a whisper remained fleeting or hardened into legend. In Europe, monastic chroniclers were among the first to give shape to royal rumor. Their duty was ostensibly to record the passing of years, births, deaths, wars, alliances, but their pens often lingered on morality. Queens, as embodiments of virtue and dynastic stability, became particularly vulnerable to moral scrutiny. A queen who appeared too independent, too ambitious, or too close to men beyond the king, was presented not as a political actor, but as a cautionary figure. The chronicler's ink transformed political partnership into forbidden passion, ambition into adultery, and female agency into scandal. Take for instance the writings surrounding Eleanor of Aquitaine. As discussed earlier, Eleanor's time in Antioch during the Second Crusade inspired suspicion among Louis VII's court. Chroniclers framed her association with her uncle Raymond of Portuguese as improper, suggesting that her desire for autonomy and strategy in crusading matters was proof of illicit intimacy. Whether Eleanor's relationship with Raymond was affectionate, political, or entirely innocent mattered less than the fact that her independence needed to be explained. To a chronicler steeped in a moralizing tradition, the explanation lay not in her intellect but in her supposed susceptibility to desire. Ambassadors played a different but equally powerful role. These men, stationed in foreign courts, wrote detailed reports back to their monarchs, blending observation with interpretation. Their letters often commented on the conduct of queens, consorts, and noblewomen. In 16th century Europe, ambassadors from Venice, Spain and France reported from courts across the continent, and their descriptions were colored by political motives. If it suited diplomacy to depict a queen as virtuous, she was praised as an exemplar of chastity. If it suited to destabilize her image, whispers of infidelity or improper closeness were woven into reports. Thus, a queen's reputation could shift not according to her actions, but according to the needs of foreign policy. In the East, the role of chroniclers was no less significant. Ottoman court historians, known as Shinameti, recorded the lives of sultans and their households, weaving official narratives of legitimacy and divine order. Yet even within these carefully controlled accounts, hints of scandal crept in. Women who exercised unusual influence, whether Kozum Sultan in the 17th century or Hurrem Sultan Roxolana in the 16th, became subjects of both admiration and suspicion. European travelers to the Ottoman court, often barred from the harem itself, filled the void of knowledge with imagination. Their writings described the harem as a place of secret liaisons and forbidden lovers, reinforcing the idea that queens and consorts, if powerful, must have transgressed. The absence of direct observation did not prevent the creation of narrative, it encouraged fabrication. The Mughal court, too, preserved its own chronicles, such as the Akbarnama and the Tuzuka Jahangiri. These texts were often celebratory, focusing on the grandeur of emperors and the loyalty of their households. Yet when a queen rose to prominence, like Nogahan, even supportive accounts could not silence rival narratives. Opponents wrote counter-stories that attributed her power to improper closeness with nobles, rather than to her administrative skill. In this way, the chronicler became a political weapon. A queen's enemies could tarnish her legacy, not by defeating her in life, but by reshaping her memory on paper. What emerges from these records is not a transparent window into history, but a hall of mirrors. Each chronicler, monk, or ambassador, wrote from a position shaped by loyalty, morality, or political convenience. To read their words is to glimpse less of the queen herself and more of the anxieties of her time. Female autonomy unsettled the medieval imagination. Queens were meant to embody fidelity, purity, and obedience. When they deviated, or when they simply appeared too strong, chroniclers sought explanations that fit within a framework of suspicion. Desire was the easiest, most enduring explanation. This process reveals why so many queens across centuries are remembered not primarily for their patronage, diplomacy, or governance, but for rumors of forbidden shadows. Once written, a rumor became part of the record. Centuries later, historians rereading these texts encountered whispers that had hardened into apparent fact. Isabella of France's alliance with Mortimer, for instance, is remembered as an affair because chroniclers chose to interpret it that way. Eleanor's time in Antioch is remembered as scandalous because chroniclers made it so. The harem of the Ottomans is remembered as a place of secret liaisons because travelers wrote of it in that language. In the silence of libraries and archives, these words endure. The watchful eyes of chroniclers transformed fleeting suspicions into historical memory. Queens who walked once beneath the gaze of attendants now walk eternally beneath the gaze of readers, their reputations shadowed not by their own choices, but by the interpretations of men who sought to explain them. Thus, when we think of queens and forbidden shadows, we are often thinking less of reality and more of record. The chronicler's pen was sharper than rumor itself, capable of shaping centuries of perception. And once inscribed, the whisper became unending, repeating across time, carried into our own age as though it were truth. In the quiet tension of royal courts, rumor had a way of transfiguring into judgment. A queen did not need to be caught in the act of betrayal to suffer its consequences. It was enough for suspicion to circulate, enough for chroniclers to whisper, and enough for a rival to suggest disloyalty. Once the accusation was spoken aloud, the machinery of power and morality was set into motion. For queens accused of forbidden desire, the cost was rarely light. Their bodies, their freedom, and their very memory became subject to punishment. Imprisonment was one of the most common tools of retribution. A palace chamber could become a prison as effectively as stone walls. Queens suspected of betrayal were confined within their own households, cut off from influence, their movements restricted to courtyards or single rooms. The silence of such imprisonment was as severe as any execution, for it stripped them of their visibility. Queens were meant to embody the dynasty, to stand beside kings in ceremonies and appear before their subjects as symbols of stability. To be hidden away was to be erased. In England, Eleanor of Aquitaine herself endured imprisonment, not because of whispers of lovers, but because of rebellion against Henry II. Yet the image of a queen locked away in towers and castles became inseparable from punishment for suspected intimacy. The walls themselves became symbols of shame, reminders that the queen's body was no longer her own to display but the king's to conceal. When suspicion grew more severe, exile was the chosen tool. Some queens were sent back to their natal families, their marriages dissolved in disgrace, others were pushed into remote estates, stripped of their courts and attendants, left to live in enforced solitude. This was a quieter form of punishment, but no less final. A queen in exile was a queen without a stage, without a throne, without the visibility that had defined her existence. She became a shadow herself, spoken of in past tense, her life reduced to the echo of her former station. The danger of exile lay not in its violence but in its silence, a gradual erasure. Yet the most chilling fate was execution. The axeman, the sword or the rope awaited queens whose supposed betrayal was judged treasonous. In monarchies where dynastic legitimacy was fragile, the suspicion that a queen had lain with a lover beyond the king was not merely a moral failing, it was a threat to the line of succession, for it called into question the legitimacy of heirs. If the king could not be sure that his sons were his own, the foundation of his dynasty trembled. Thus whispers of forbidden desire could be recast as treason, punishable by death. Perhaps the most famous example is Anne Boleyn, Queen of England and the second wife of Henry VIII. Accused in 1536 of adultery with several men including her own brother, she was tried and executed at the Tower of London. Historians continue to debate whether the charges were fabricated to clear the way for Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour. Yet what matters here is not the truth of her actions but the way suspicion transformed into punishment. Anne's independence, wit, and failure to provide a male heir were recast as evidence of infidelity. Once condemned, she walked the short path from queen to traitor, her body ending beneath the sword. Other queens met similar fates. Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, was executed in 1542 after accusations of adultery. The charge was not only that she had lovers before marriage but that she had continued intimacy afterward. At 17 she was barely more than a girl, yet her youth did not save her. The fear of tainted succession demanded her death. Her punishment was as much a warning to others as it was a judgment of her own conduct. Beyond England, Europe offered further examples. In Scotland, Mary, Queen of Scots, was accused of complicity in her husband's murder, and of an affair with the Earl of Bothwell, whom she later married. Though her life did not end immediately, she was forced to abdicate and eventually fled to England, where she spent 19 years in confinement before being executed. Here too, suspicion of forbidden intimacy blended with politics, producing a punishment that stretched across decades before concluding on the scaffold. Elsewhere, quieter punishments took different forms. In Catholic Europe, some queens accused of infidelity were forced into convents. The cloister served as both prison and sanctuary, removing them from public life while preserving the appearance of piety. Within the convent walls, the queen exchanged crown and ceremony for veil and silence. The cloister became the final stage of her life, a place where forbidden desire was erased through ritual, fasting, and prayer. Some survived many years in this state, their names slowly fading from political memory, remembered only in chronicles as cautionary examples. In the Ottoman Empire, where the legitimacy of the Sultan's heirs was paramount, punishment was swift and severe. Consorts or even concubines accused of betrayal were drowned in the Bosphorus, their bodies disappearing into the current. Stories of such executions circulated widely, though historians debate their frequency, whether myth or fact. These tales conveyed the danger of suspicion in a system where the dynasty's purity was fiercely guarded. A queen or consort accused of disloyalty was not merely dishonored, she was erased, her presence in the palace extinguished without ceremony. The severity of these punishments reflects the weight of the queen's role. To accuse a queen of forbidden desire was to suggest not only a personal betrayal but a dynastic crisis. The legitimacy of heirs, the stability of alliances, the image of virtue projected to subjects and rivals, all were bound up in the queen's body. Thus, her punishment was never private. Whether execution, exile, imprisonment, or forced vows, it was meant to demonstrate to the world that order had been restored. The queen's fall became a performance of control, her suffering a symbol of dynastic purification. What is striking is how unevenly the punishments fell. Kings themselves often kept mistresses openly, their infidelities tolerated or even celebrated. Queens, by contrast, bore the full cost of suspicion. Their desire was not their own to express, for their bodies were considered vessels of lineage. The double standard was both glaring and enduring, a reminder that queens lived within structures that demanded perfection but offered no mercy. In the end, the cost of desire was rarely desire itself. It was suspicion, interpretation, and projection. Queens who never strayed could still be imprisoned or executed if rivals wished it so. Queens who longed silently could still be erased for the suggestion of longing. Desire was punished less as an act than as an idea, an anxiety that haunted dynasties and demanded resolution through suffering. And so, in the long corridors of history, one finds the quiet ghosts of queens who paid the ultimate price for whispers. Their fates, imprisonment, exile, execution, or disappearance into cloisters, remind us that the shadow of suspicion could be heavier than stone, sharper than the sword, and more enduring than rumor itself. The courts of late medieval and early Renaissance Spain were environments of spectacle and scrutiny, where ceremony masked rivalries and the weight of dynasty pressed heavily upon queens. Here the question of intimacy was never private. It was framed by politics, magnified by ambassadors' reports, and preserved in chronicles. Few stories illustrate this tension more poignantly than that of Joanna of Castile, 1479-1555. whose life was shaped as much by rumor and perception as by fact. Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the Catholic monarchs who united Spain and oversaw both the Reconquista and the first voyages across the Atlantic. From the moment of her birth, she was part of a dynasty defined by both ambition and surveillance. As the third child, Joanna was not initially destined for rule, yet the deaths of her elder siblings and their heirs brought her unexpectedly to the center of succession. Her life, which might have been shaped by convent walls or secondary marriages, became the axis upon which the Spanish throne turned. In 1496, Joanna married Philip the Handsome of the House of Habsburg, a union that strengthened Spain's alliance with Burgundy and Austria. Their marriage was marked by deep attachment, at least in its early years, but also by tension. Philip was known for his charm, his beauty, and his infidelities. Joanna's affection for him, by many accounts, bordered on obsession. When she discovered his affairs, her grief and jealousy became the subject of gossip. Chroniclers described her as violent in her reactions, struggling with emotions that spilled beyond the boundaries of queenly composure. It is here that rumor began to define her. A queen's reputation was expected to be one of dignity and restraint, but Joanna was portrayed as unbalanced, consumed by love and desire. Reports circulated of her beating her rivals, confronting Philip's mistresses, and even lashing out at Philip himself. Whether these stories were exaggerated or not, they cemented her image as a woman ruled by passion, unable to maintain the stoic distance that queenship demanded. Her intimacy with Philip, at once genuine and turbulent, became the lens through which all of her actions were interpreted. When Philip died in 1506, the rumors multiplied. Joanna, only in her late 20s, was devastated. Chroniclers claimed she refused to part from his body, traveling across Castile with his coffin, opening it at intervals to look upon him, and resisting all efforts to bury him. This tale, repeated endlessly, gave rise to her epithet, Joanna la Loca, Joanna the Mad. The image of a queen wandering the countryside with her dead husband became a symbol of excessive, irrational devotion, a desire carried beyond the boundaries of life itself. Historians now question the accuracy of these accounts. It is possible that political motives magnified Joanna's grief into madness. Her father Ferdinand, and later her son Charles V, both had reason to sideline her, to depict her as unfit to rule, as consumed by desire and deranged by loss, was to justify removing her from power. Thus, the rumor of forbidden intimacy with shadows, in Joanna's case, was transformed into the image of pathological love, her body and mind, cast as unreliable vessels of sovereignty. For the remaining decades of her life, Joanna lived in confinement. From 1509 until her death in 1555, she was held at the royal palace of Tordesillas, effectively imprisoned by her own family. Her daughter Catherine accompanied her, but her existence was one of isolation and control. Chroniclers visiting her reported signs of instability, though again these may have been colored by political intent. Whether she was truly mad, or deliberately portrayed as such, remains a matter of debate. What is clear is that her punishment mirrored those of queens accused of forbidden shadows, confinement, erasure, the stripping away of agency. Joanna's story exemplifies the Spanish court's preoccupation with both lineage and perception. Her intimacy with Philip, her grief at his death, and her supposed inability to control passion were recast into a political narrative. She became less a queen in her own right than a figure of warning, a woman whose excessive desire unraveled dynastic order. In truth, her life reflects the precariousness of queenship itself. To love too deeply was to risk the label of madness. To deviate from expected composure was to invite erasure. Beyond Joanna, other Spanish queens also encountered whispers of forbidden intimacy. Isabella of Portugal, the wife of Charles V, was occasionally scrutinized for her closeness to courtiers, though her reputation ultimately remained intact due to her piety and her early death. Later, in the 17th century, Marie Antoinette of Austria, as regent for her son Charles II, faced criticism from ambassadors who accused her of excessive influence over favorites, a charge always tinged with the suggestion of inappropriate closeness. In Spain, as elsewhere, The queen's body and conduct were inseparable from dynastic stability, making her an easy vessel for rumor. The Spanish court itself fostered such narratives. It was a space of rigid ceremony and pervasive observation. The queens of Castile and Aragon moved through highly structured rituals designed to project dignity. Yet behind the veils of ceremony, ambassadors' reports and chroniclers' notes preserved every gesture, every moment of visible emotion. A queen who wept too openly, who lingered too near a courtier, or who clung too visibly to her husband became a subject of comment. The line between devotion and excess, intimacy and scandal, was drawn by the men who observed her, not by the queen herself. In the silence of Tordesillas, Joanna of Castile's life stretched into shadow. Once Queen of Spain, daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, wife of Philip the Handsome, and mother of Charles V, she became a figure remembered for madness, passion and rumor, rather than sovereignty. Her story illustrates not only the personal cost of intimacy, but the broader truth. In the Spanish courts, the queen's desire, real or imagined, was a weapon wielded by others to justify control. The French court was never merely a seat of power. It was a stage, a theatre, where every glance was an act, every gesture a performance, and every silence an invitation for speculation. Queens who walked through its corridors and appeared beneath its chandeliers lived lives of unrelenting visibility, their identities both carefully constructed and perpetually undermined by rumor. France, more than almost any other realm, created a mystique around its queens, a paradoxical blend of reverence and suspicion, where grace was praised in public but desire was always imagined in private. Within this atmosphere, women like Marguerite of Navarre and Marie Antoinette became enduring symbols of how rumor could reshape queenship, transforming the ordinary rhythms of court life into stories of forbidden shadows. Marguerite of Navarre, sister to King Francis I, embodied refinement, intellect, and an unusual literary voice. She wrote poetry and stories at a time when women of her station were expected to be silent muses rather than creators. Her Heptameron, modeled after Boccaccio's Decameron, offered tales of temptation, betrayal and love, all wrapped in the setting of noble conversation. Though these were works of imagination, the act of putting such thoughts into words unsettled her contemporaries. Many whispered that such vivid depictions of desire and deception could only have been drawn from her own experience, as if a woman's creativity must inevitably be an echo of hidden acts. Her closeness to poets, philosophers, and reformist theologians only deepened this suspicion. The French court, ever eager to cloak intelligence in scandal, shaped her image not only as a patron of letters, but as a woman who must surely have walked too near the edges of propriety. It was enough to bind her legacy to an aura of forbidden intimacy, whether true or invented, and to remind others that the boundary between intellectual boldness and moral suspicion was perilously thin for a queen. 2 centuries later, Marie Antoinette found herself at the very heart of a court where rumor had become a weapon as powerful as any blade. An Austrian archduchess married into the French crown, she was marked from the beginning by her foreignness, her youth, and her unfamiliarity with the labyrinth of Versailles. Her taste for fashion and music, her fondness for the petit train and her difficulties in producing an heir all made her an easy target. Pamphlets known as libelles circulated across Paris, dripping with venom and invention, portraying her not only as a spendthrift but as a woman of uncontrollable appetite. Lovers were assigned to her as if drawn from a deck of cards, Swedish nobles like Axel von Fersen, charming courtiers, and even women of her own household. Some of the accusations turned darker still, painting her in grotesque tones of depravity, transforming her into a symbol not merely of decadence but of corruption itself. In truth, much of her private life was marked more by tedium than scandal. Her relationship with Fersen, though affectionate, remains ambiguous, and many of the claims about her excesses were crafted not from observation but from political need. Yet by the late 1780s, the portrait of Marie Antoinette that spread through France was not that of a queen struggling with her role, but of a figure embodying everything the people despised about monarchy. At her trial in 1793, the accusations went beyond politics and reached into the realm of the grotesque. with charges that included the unthinkable suggestion of incest with her own son. It was not fact but theatre, a final act in which rumour itself became evidence, and a queen who once presided over glittering balls was reduced to a symbol of corruption to justify her fall beneath the guillotine. What unites Marguerite of Navarre and Marie Antoinette is less their personal choices than the environment in which they lived. The French court was constructed as a place of constant performance, where appearances were ritualized and meanings endlessly interpreted. To write a story that touched upon love, as Marguerite did, or to enjoy the companionship of trusted friends, as Marie Antoinette did, was to invite reinterpretation. Every gesture became a line in someone else's tale, every pause an opening for scandal. In this way, queens in France were remembered less for their sovereignty than for the whispers that surrounded them, the stories that reimagined them as women of forbidden shadows, caught in a web woven by others. In the end, the mystique of the French queens lay in this interplay between reality and rumour. They lived their lives in public light, yet the most enduring portraits of them were painted in shadows, not by artists' brushes but by the imaginations of those who sought to explain, condemn or destroy. And so, long after their voices were silenced, it was not their actions but the echoes of whispers that shaped how they were remembered. If France cultivated queens as figures of mystique, England seemed intent on making them warnings. Nowhere is this clearer than in the turbulent century of the Tudors, where the monarchy's survival rested precariously on heirs, alliances, and the bodies of queens themselves. In England, the suspicion of a queen's private life was not confined to whispers or pamphlets, it became statecraft. The intimate choices of women like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were not only matters of curiosity, but of treason. Their supposed betrayals turned into public theatre that reshaped the monarchy, and etched their names into history as cautionary tales. Anne Boleyn, perhaps the most famous of Henry VIII's 6 wives, entered the English court not as a queen but as a lady-in-waiting, first to Margaret of Austria, and later to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Intelligent, educated, and striking, she soon caught the attention of the king. What followed was less a courtship than a reordering of the English kingdom. Henry's infatuation with Anne and his frustration at his lack of a male heir with Catherine led him to break from Rome, creating the Church of England and setting aside the authority of the Pope. For years, Anne was the object of longing, promise and suspicion. She was a queen in waiting, a figure upon whom Henry had staked his personal desire and his dynastic ambition. When Anne was crowned queen in 1533, she carried not only the crown but also the weight of an entire nation's expectations. Her coronation was a grand spectacle, yet beneath its splendour lay the murmurings of discontent. Many saw her as the cause of England's rupture with Rome, a usurper who had displaced the pious Catherine. In such a climate, every gesture of Anne's became material for rumour. Her wit was reinterpreted as arrogance, her friendships as illicit connections, and her inability to produce a surviving son as evidence of divine disfavour. By the time Henry's affection waned, Anne was surrounded by enemies eager to transform suspicion into condemnation. In 1536, she was arrested and accused of adultery, incest, and even plotting the king's death. Among those named as her supposed lovers were court musicians, courtiers, and even her own brother George Boleyn. The charges were extravagant, the evidence weak, but the narrative was powerful. A queen who had risen through charm and ambition was undone by forbidden shadows. In the carefully staged trial, Anne defended herself with dignity, yet it made little difference. The outcome had already been decided. On May 19, 1536, she was executed at the Tower of London, her fall a spectacle that reinforced the message that queenship was inseparable from loyalty, and that loyalty was defined entirely by the king's will. Anne's legacy, immortalized by chroniclers and dramatists, remains inseparable from this tension between passion, rumour, and power. Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife, would repeat this grim pattern a few years later, though in a different register. Young, vivacious, and barely out of adolescence when she married the aging king, Catherine represented renewal and charm, but her past relationships and her conduct at court soon gave rise to whispers. Letters and testimonies suggested that before her marriage, she had known intimacy with men such as Francis Derham, and her closeness to the courtier Thomas Culpeper during her queenship fed rumours that spread with alarming speed. Whether Catherine truly betrayed Henry, or merely indulged in indiscretions magnified by politics remains debated, but the effect was the same. By 1542, the Queen was accused of adultery, and the language of treason again shaped her fate. The trial and execution of Catherine Howard echoed that of Anne Boleyn, though the details differed. She was portrayed less as an ambitious manipulator than as a foolish, reckless girl consumed by desire. Her story was presented to the public as a lesson in the dangers of female weakness and moral corruption. When she was executed, she joined Anne in the role of queens who had been undone by the suggestion of forbidden shadows, their bodies transformed from symbols of dynastic hope to warnings of betrayal. The Tudor court, with its rigid hierarchies and relentless surveillance, was a place where rumor thrived. Courtiers observed queens closely, ambassadors reported every detail to foreign powers, and even the smallest slip could become magnified into treason. For Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, it was not necessarily their actions alone, but the readiness of the court to believe and exploit rumor that sealed their fate. Queenship in Tudor England was a narrow passage. The Queen had to be visible enough to embody majesty, yet invisible enough in her private life to avoid suspicion. To stumble, even slightly, was to fall into shadow. Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, would inherit not only the throne but also this legacy of suspicion. Though she never married, her life was riddled with speculation about supposed lovers, from Robert Dudley to Francis Drake. Her refusal to wed only intensified the whispers, casting her as a queen who either harbored forbidden desires or denied them unnaturally. For Elizabeth, survival required a careful dance. She cultivated intimacy yet never allowed it to become proof. By holding herself aloof, she transformed rumor into mystique, turning the vulnerability of queenship into a strategy of power. In this sense, Elizabeth learned from the fates of her mother and cousin Catherine Howard. She understood that in England, a queen's survival depended not on avoiding rumor, but on mastering it. The English tales of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and Elizabeth I reveal the peculiar severity with which England judged its queens. Unlike France, where rumor could flourish in pamphlets, or Spain, where whispers confined queens to palaces, in England, rumor was bound directly to survival. To be accused was to be condemned, and to be condemned was often to die. The Queen was both the heart of the monarchy and its most vulnerable member, her life a perpetual negotiation between ceremony and suspicion. In the wider perspective, these stories illustrate how England fashioned its own narrative of queenship as both power and peril. Queens were expected to embody virtue, yet they were surrounded by courtiers and attendants who could at any moment be cast as shadows of temptation. To remain above suspicion was nearly impossible. To fall into it was fatal. The Tudors, with their executions and exiles, turned queenship into a stage where betrayal was not simply feared but anticipated. A drama that reaffirmed the absolute power of the crown. Thus, the English queens of the 16th century became more than figures of history. They became parables of loyalty and treachery, their names invoked for centuries as symbols of both the allure and the danger of desire. To walk in their footsteps is to enter a world where palaces held more than splendor. They held whispers, shadows, and the unyielding certainty that even a queen could be undone by what others chose to believe about her. As the story of queenship drifts northward into the colder landscapes of Scandinavia and across the vastness of Russia, the atmosphere changes, but the shadows remain. In these realms, palaces rose not only as symbols of majesty, but as fortresses against harsh winters, dynastic feuds, and the unyielding scrutiny of nobles. Here too, queens were drawn into webs of suspicion, their private lives observed, exaggerated, and reshaped into narratives that echoed through both court chronicles and popular lore. The North may have seemed far from the elaborate theatres of France and England, yet the same motifs appear: whispers of forbidden lovers, accusations of disloyalty, and the relentless intertwining of desire and political power. In Scandinavia, one of the most remarkable figures was Christina of Sweden, who reigned in the mid-17th century. Ascending the throne in 1632, after the death of her father Gustavus Adolphus, Christina grew into a queen of unusual independence. She surrounded herself with philosophers, artists, and courtiers, cultivating a court more famous for intellectual debate than for dynastic order. Yet this very independence invited speculation. Christina famously resisted marriage, a refusal that in itself created rumors. Was it austerity, piety, or passion that guided her? Chroniclers and foreign observers speculated endlessly, their uncertainty feeding stories of hidden attachments. Her close relationships with women such as Ebba Spa were framed by contemporaries as romantic, even erotic, though modern historians tread carefully in separating fact from suggestion. In her choice to abdicate the throne in 1654 and convert to Catholicism, Christina further fueled the air of enigma. Her reign and her retreat became a canvas upon which questions of gender, desire and sovereignty were painted, leaving her legacy shaped as much by rumor as by her own decisions. The Scandinavian courts also preserved darker stories. Queens who married into Denmark and Norway often found themselves in precarious positions, expected to cement alliances yet vulnerable to suspicion. The case of Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, Queen Consort of Denmark in the 18th century, stands as one of the starkest examples. Married to King Christian VII, who was troubled by mental illness and erratic behavior, Caroline Matilda formed a close bond with the royal physician Johann Friedrich Struensee. Their companionship, intellectual as well as personal, quickly became a subject of scandal. Whispers of an affair spread rapidly, and soon the physician was seen as wielding too much influence over both queen and king. When a coup in 1772 brought Struensee's downfall, he was executed brutally, and Caroline Matilda was exiled. Whether their relationship had been one of genuine intimacy, or simply a friendship magnified by crisis mattered little. In the eyes of the court she had crossed the threshold of propriety. Her punishment reflected a pattern seen elsewhere. The queen who reached toward forbidden shadows, or who was believed to have done so, could be silenced through removal and disgrace. The Russian court, grander in scale and far more volatile, offers even more striking examples. Here the power of queens, empresses in their own right, was matched only by the intensity of the rumors that surrounded them. Nowhere is this clearer than in the story of Catherine the Great, who ruled Russia from 1762 to 1796. Her rise to power began with shadows of intrigue, for it was with the support of military officers and courtiers that she overthrew her husband Peter III. From the beginning, her authority was bound to questions of intimacy and loyalty. To her detractors, Catherine was not a sovereign in her own right, but a woman elevated by lovers. Pamphlets and satirical accounts across Europe depicted her as insatiable, assigning her an endless parade of companions, many of whom were in fact advisors and confidants. The sheer breadth of these accusations reveals less about Catherine's private life than about the unease with a woman wielding such vast power. To diminish her achievements, the expansion of Russia's territory, the flourishing of Enlightenment ideas at her court, the reforms in administration, her enemies recast her as a woman of ungoverned desire. The infamous and entirely fabricated story of her supposed death in a scandalous act with a horse, repeated in whispers long after her reign, illustrates how rumor sought not only to discredit her but to humiliate her memory. Catherine's case is perhaps the clearest example of how queenship in Russia could never be disentangled from gossip about forbidden lovers, whether real, exaggerated, or wholly imagined. Yet Catherine was not alone. Before her, Sophia Alexeyevna, regent of Russia during the late 17th century, also faced the double-edged scrutiny of power and intimacy. As a woman ruling in a patriarchal society, she was accused of relying too heavily on her favorite, Prince Vasily Golitsyn, with whom many claimed she shared not only political but personal attachment. Whether true or not, the charge that she was swayed by forbidden affection provided her opponents with grounds to undermine her regency. Her eventual removal and confinement to a convent echoed the fate of many queens across Europe. When power faltered, rumor provided the justification for erasure. What stands out in the northern courts is the way dynastic struggle magnified the stakes of rumor. In Sweden, Denmark and Russia alike, the line between personal intimacy and political allegiance was perilously thin. To love too openly, to rely too closely on a favorite, or even to refuse the traditional path of marriage was to invite whispers that could shape the course of reigns. The queens of the north lived in courts where noble factions vied for influence, where foreign ambassadors carried tales to distant capitals, and where the stability of a throne could hinge upon a rumor whispered in the palace corridor. The climate itself, with its long winters, and the heaviness of stone palaces, seemed to deepen the atmosphere of suspicion. Queens who wandered the halls of St. Petersburg's Winter Palace or Copenhagen's Rosenborg Castle did so in spaces that amplified both their grandeur and their isolation. Surrounded by courtiers whose loyalty was uncertain, they carried the burden of both visibility and vulnerability. Their reputations, like those of Anne Boleyn or Marie Antoinette, were rarely their own to shape. They were constructed by others, by chroniclers, diplomats and enemies, and preserved as stories that blurred the boundary between truth and invention. The northern tales remind us that queenship was not a condition of ease but of perpetual exposure. In these courts, where power was precarious and succession uncertain, the queen was always at risk of being recast as a figure of scandal, whether through the suggestion of a forbidden lover, or through the mere suspicion of closeness that others found convenient to exploit. The result was a pattern repeated across centuries and kingdoms. To rule as a queen was to stand in light while being pursued by shadows that could at any moment be reshaped into accusations strong enough to end a reign or a life. The quiet corridors of convents, far removed from the great halls of power, often became the final chapters in the lives of queens whose presence had once commanded attention in palaces and courts. For many, the cloister was not a choice freely made, but a sentence handed down in response to scandal, suspicion, or political necessity. These spaces of prayer and silence offered neither absolution nor escape from the rumors that had followed them. Instead, they became places where the shadow of forbidden love lingered, reshaped into tales whispered by chroniclers and preserved in memory long after the queens themselves had withdrawn from the world. In medieval and early modern Europe, the convent was an acceptable solution to the problem of a queen whose presence in court had become untenable. If divorce, execution, or exile to foreign lands carried risks, the cloister provided an alternative that was both punitive and pious. A queen removed to a convent could be erased from political life without the bloodshed that might stain a monarch's reputation. Within the walls of these religious houses, the royal woman might live out decades in obscurity, her existence reduced to routine and ritual. Yet even there, her story did not fade. The act of sending a queen to a convent was itself a statement, one that echoed far beyond the cloister gates. One of the earliest and most striking examples is that of Ingeborg of Denmark, wife of King Philip II of France. Married in 1193, she found herself abruptly repudiated by her husband, who sought to annul the union almost immediately. Ingeborg was confined to a convent, living in practical imprisonment for years while legal and ecclesiastical battles played out. Although she was eventually restored to her position as queen, the years of cloistered silence left their mark, turning her into a symbol of the precariousness of queenship and the vulnerability of women to the whims of kings. The story repeats in later centuries. Isabella of Portugal, widow of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, chose a convent after her husband's death, as did many royal widows who embraced religious life. For them, the cloister was less a punishment and more a socially acceptable retreat, a place to withdraw from the turbulence of dynastic politics. Yet even in these cases, the shadow of rumor followed. The presence of a former queen in a convent was never wholly private. Ambassadors reported on her health, her piety, and even her interactions with confessors and visitors. The veil of religious seclusion could not fully shield her from the public gaze. Perhaps the most poignant examples are those of queens accused of forbidden attachments. Joan of Navarre, stepmother to Henry V of England, found herself accused of witchcraft in 1419, her alleged crimes tied to suspicions of disloyalty and hidden alliances. Though she was imprisoned rather than cloistered, her confinement echoed the same principle. When a queen's reputation threatened the crown, she could be silenced by removal. In other cases, the convent became the physical embodiment of that silence, a place where a queen's past was buried under the weight of religious ritual. The convents themselves, with their stone walls, narrow cells, and rhythmic cycles of prayer, amplified the atmosphere of exile. For a queen accustomed to the grandeur of palaces and the constant presence of attendants, the transition must have been profound. Yet the cloister was never entirely devoid of politics. Many convents received substantial royal patronage, and nuns of noble birth often carried their own networks of influence. A queen in exile might still receive visitors, maintain correspondence, and shape perceptions of her fate. Even in silence, her presence remained a reminder of dynastic conflict and the fragility of royal marriages. The Spanish Habsburgs offer several examples of royal women retreating into religious life. Juana of Austria, daughter of Charles V, entered the convent of Las Descalzas Reales in Madrid, where she became abbess. Though her life there was marked by devotion, her position as a former regent of Spain meant she continued to exercise influence. In her case, the convent became both sanctuary and stage, a place where religious seclusion and political memory coexisted. The convent as a destination for queens reflects a broader pattern. Royal women were rarely allowed to simply disappear. Even when cloistered, their existence carried meaning for dynasties and courts. Their silence was read as submission, their seclusion as either punishment or piety. Chroniclers noted their deaths, their burials, and their legacies, often framing them in ways that reinforced the narratives of their husbands or successors. A queen who entered a convent might no longer walk palace halls, but she continued to haunt the imagination of those who spoke of her. In the broader arc of queenship, the cloister represents both an end and a continuation. It marked the conclusion of public life, the closing of a chapter in which whispers of forbidden love or suspicions of betrayal had played their part. But it also extended the queen's story into a quieter, more subdued realm where her presence could still be felt. The convent was less an escape from shadows than a new setting in which they gathered differently, softer perhaps, but no less persistent. Thus, the cloistered silence of convents did not erase the past. It preserved it in hushed tones in the memory of courtiers, in the reports of ambassadors, and in the enduring fascination with queens who lived between the light of power and the darkness of rumor. The stone walls, far from shielding them, became the backdrop against which their stories were reimagined, long after their voices had been hushed by the rituals of prayer. In the dimly lit galleries of Europe's palaces, where the polished stone floors echoed with measured footsteps, and where flickering candlelight illuminated the gilded frames of paintings, another kind of history unfolded, a history written not in chronicles or decrees, but in pigments, brushstrokes, verses, and melodies. The language of art, subtle and elusive, provided a means of recording what could not be spoken aloud. Forbidden desires, rumored affairs, and the hidden lives of queens and consorts left their traces in allegories and symbols, in portraits that seemed to look too intently, and in verses that lingered on themes of secrecy and longing. For queens whose reputations were perpetually vulnerable, the arts provided both a veil and a mirror. A painter might portray a queen in carefully chosen attire, her hand resting upon a symbolic object, her gaze directed away from the viewer. Each detail could be interpreted as a commentary, whether intended or not. The presence of certain flowers, the placement of a book, or the inclusion of a mythological figure in the background might be read as a coded suggestion. To the casual observer, these were mere embellishments. To those attuned to the courtly language of symbolism, they whispered of deeper currents. The Renaissance, with its revival of classical mythology, offered especially fertile ground for such coded representations. Queens and noble women were often depicted as goddesses or heroines, their identities cloaked in allegory, yet recognizable to those who knew the context. A queen might be cast as Venus, surrounded by symbols of love and beauty, or as Diana, embodying chastity, but also the hunt. The choice of myth carried meaning. Venus could suggest not only beauty but indulgence, while Diana's independence from male desire might hint at rejection or secrecy. Such images allowed painters to address themes of intimacy and power without ever speaking directly of them. Poets, too, played with layers of suggestion. Courtly love, a tradition carried from medieval troubadours into Renaissance and Baroque courts, thrived on ambiguity. Verses addressed to an unnamed lady, filled with metaphors of light and shadow, became vehicles for expressing forbidden affection. Whether the poet's muse was truly the queen or another noble woman mattered less than the possibility. The circulation of such poems within courtly circles ensured that whispers attached themselves to their words. A sonnet describing a woman's beauty compared to the dawn might be taken as harmless flattery, or as evidence of an unspoken attachment between poet and sovereign. The role of music must also be considered. Court balladeers, composers, and musicians wrote songs that were performed in salons and chambers, their lyrics often carrying layers of meaning. Love songs sung in the presence of queens could be interpreted as messages directed toward them, whether or not the intention was real. In the restrained world of royal etiquette, where direct declarations of feeling were impossible, art became the vessel through which desire or rumor of desire could travel. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of symbolism shaping perceptions of queens lies in the portraits of Marie Antoinette. Though painted in the 18th century, long after the Renaissance, her images reveal how art could alternately defend or condemn. In official portraits, she was portrayed as the epitome of maternal virtue, surrounded by her children, or dressed in sober attire to counter rumors of extravagance and impropriety. Yet satirical prints, circulated in secret, recast her in scandalous poses, insinuating forbidden lovers and immoral behavior. In this way, art became not just a mirror, but a weapon, encoding accusations in lines and colors. Earlier examples can be traced in the Italian courts of the Renaissance. Isabella d'Este, Marchioness of Mantua, was immortalized in countless portraits and allegories. Known for her patronage of the arts, she was often depicted as classical figures symbolizing wisdom and virtue. Yet behind these images lay the reality of a woman navigating the suspicion of rivals and the scrutiny of chroniclers. The very need to portray her as chaste, wise, and beyond reproach suggests the undercurrent of rumor that haunted even the most celebrated queens and noble women. In Russia too, the visual language of art played its role. Empresses were painted in elaborate regalia, but whispers shaped the interpretation of even the smallest detail. A gesture, a tilt of the head, or the choice of a mythological motif could be read as evidence of intimacy with a favorite courtier. Catherine the Great's portraits, for instance, often emphasized her as Minerva or as a lawgiver, reinforcing her authority. Yet satirical art abroad undermined this image, recasting her as a figure of unchecked desire. Even architecture and decorative arts could participate in this language of suggestion. Tapestries hung in palace chambers often depicted mythological or biblical scenes with moral undertones. A scene of Susanna and the elders might be interpreted as a reminder of chastity, or alternatively, as an allusion to the perils of being watched. A painting of Hercules and Omphale could symbolize the inversion of gender roles, subtly reflecting anxieties about powerful queens and their supposed male favorites. What makes the language of paintings, poems, and ballads so compelling is the way it blurred the line between fact and fiction. Once an image or verse was produced, its meaning was no longer under the control of its creator. A flattering allegory might be read as evidence of intimacy, a satirical caricature might solidify suspicion, and a love poem might attach itself to a queen's name whether or not she had ever been the intended muse. These artistic artifacts thus became part of the machinery by which queens' reputations were constructed, defended, or destroyed. The passage of centuries has only deepened the ambiguity. Modern historians can rarely distinguish between artistic convention and coded reference with certainty. Was a queen painted as Venus because she was admired, or because she was suspected? Did a ballad hint at a secret love, or merely employ the stock imagery of the courtly tradition? The uncertainty itself reflects the atmosphere in which these queens lived, an atmosphere where visibility was unavoidable, and where every image, every word, every song might be turned into a commentary on their loyalty or their desires. In this way, the language of art was both beautiful and dangerous. It provided queens with a form of immortality, preserving their likenesses and their reputations in color and verse. But it also bound them to the shadows of rumor, ensuring that long after their lifetimes their faces and their names would be associated with stories that may never have been true. The walls of palaces and the galleries of museums hold these echoes still, reminding us that in the courts of Europe, love and loyalty were never simply matters of the heart, but matters encoded in symbol and endlessly open to interpretation. In the long arc of history, it becomes evident that the accusations directed toward queens were rarely about passion in its raw form. They were not primarily concerned with whether a queen had truly allowed her heart to wander, or whether she had exchanged glances in shadowed corridors with a courtier. Instead, they were about power, who had it, who feared it, and who stood to gain by undermining it. The rumor of forbidden love became one of the most effective political tools in a world where direct confrontation with a reigning queen or consort might have been too dangerous or too costly. The charge was simple, universal, and devastating. To accuse a queen of disloyalty in love was to accuse her of disloyalty to the throne itself. Her body was bound symbolically to the stability of the kingdom, her chastity tied to the legitimacy of heirs, and her fidelity linked to the honor of the monarch. Thus, any suggestion of intimacy outside the marriage bed carried consequences not just for her personal standing, but for the entire structure of dynastic succession. By exploiting this fragile bond between private virtue and public order, enemies of queens could destabilize courts, topple factions, and even justify the removal of powerful women from influence. The Tudor court provides perhaps the clearest examples. Anne Boleyn, wife of Henry VIII, was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, in charges so lurid and improbable that even her contemporaries doubted their truth. Yet, truth was not the purpose. Political necessity was. Henry needed to rid himself of Anne in order to secure a new marriage, and his advisors needed her fall to realign their power. The accusations of infidelity provided the perfect pretext. Anne was executed, not because she had truly strayed, but because the machinery of politics required her destruction. Her alleged lovers, drawn from the ranks of courtiers and musicians, were collateral casualties in the political theatre. The same pattern unfolded with Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, young, vivacious, and vulnerable. She too faced charges of adultery, some of which may have held fragments of truth, but it was not her affairs themselves that sealed her fate. It was the opportunity they gave Henry's ministers to eliminate her and to reshape the balance of power at court. The narrative of betrayal, a queen dishonoring her husband, became a weapon wielded less in the service of morality than of expediency. In France, the story of Isabella of France, often called the She-Wolf of France, demonstrates how accusations could be expanded into legend. Married to Edward II of England, Isabella became entangled in political struggles that culminated in her rebellion against her husband. Chroniclers and later writers amplified her supposed relationship with Roger Mortimer, her ally and rumored lover. Whether intimacy existed or not mattered little. What mattered was that the image of a queen consort turning to another man justified her role in Edward's deposition. By portraying her as a woman swayed by passion, critics could obscure the deeper reality of political discontent, military failure, and the collapse of Edward's authority. Even queens who exercised power in their own right faced similar tactics. In Russia, Sophia Alexeyevna, who acted as regent in the late 17th century, was accused of being under the sway of her favorite Vasily Golitsyn. The rumors cast her not as a capable ruler, but as a woman manipulated by desire. By framing her political alliances as personal entanglements, her opponents could delegitimize her regency without directly challenging the idea of female sovereignty. The accusation of forbidden love thus became a cloak, disguising factional struggle as moral outrage. In many courts, ambassadors themselves were instruments of such rumor. Foreign envoys, observing queens with the scrutiny of outsiders, often reported back to their monarchs with tales of suspected affairs. These reports were not neutral. They were shaped to influence foreign policy, to cast rival courts in disrepute, or to provide justification for diplomatic maneuvering. A queen suspected of a lover could become a bargaining chip in treaties, her reputation weaponized to weaken alliances or to pressure kings into concessions. The pattern extended beyond Europe. In the Ottoman Empire, where the harem was both a household and a political institution, the sultanas and favored consorts who wielded influence were sometimes accused of affairs with eunuchs, slaves, or officials. These charges were rarely substantiated, but they served to undermine the political reach of women during the period known as the Sultanate of Women. In this way, the accusation of forbidden love crossed cultures, functioning as a nearly universal method of reducing women's power to the level of scandal. The potency of such charges lay in their plausibility. In a court filled with attendants, guards, musicians, and secretaries, a queen was never truly alone. Her movements, her glances, her conversations could always be observed, and from observation it was only a small step to insinuation. A delayed entry to chapel, a quiet exchange with a courtier, or even the choice of a particular song at a feast, could all become the seeds of rumor. Once whispered, such stories were almost impossible to refute, for to deny them was to draw further attention. The political shadow that fell upon queens therefore reveals more about the fragility of their position than about their true desires. They were women whose lives were lived at the intersection of visibility and vulnerability. Every aspect of their existence, their bodies, their words, their gestures, could be turned into evidence. Whether they were guilty or innocent mattered little. What mattered was who controlled the narrative. And in courts where power shifted with every marriage, alliance, and war, the narrative of forbidden love was a tool too effective to be ignored. Seen from the distance of centuries, these stories remind us that passion was often only the pretext. Behind every accusation of adultery, or every tale of shadowed meetings, lies a deeper reality of factional rivalry, dynastic struggle, and political necessity. The queens who suffered under such charges were less the victims of their own hearts than of the relentless strategies of those who sought to diminish them. Their legacies, recorded by chroniclers and reshaped by rumor, stand as evidence of how effectively politics could disguise itself in the language of scandal. In the palaces of Constantinople, where domes glistened with gold mosaics and marble halls echoed with the footsteps of eunuchs and courtiers, the lives of empresses unfolded under a gaze both intense and unforgiving. The Byzantine Empire, poised between East and West, inherited the ceremonial grandeur of Rome while absorbing influences from Persia and the Islamic caliphates. Within this hybrid world, the role of the empress was at once exalted and precarious. She was elevated as the visible counterpart to the emperor, draped in silks and jewels, enthroned beside him during processions and liturgies. Yet the very visibility of her office exposed her to scrutiny, and the shadow of suspicion never lingered far. Whispers of forbidden lovers, whether soldiers, courtiers, or monks, became part of the empire's endless cycle of rumor, intrigue, and political maneuvering. The Byzantine court was a place of elaborate ceremonial, its rituals designed to project stability and divine sanction, but the intimacy of palace life, confined within walls that housed hundreds of attendants, also created fertile ground for stories of secrecy. Eunuchs who served as gatekeepers and confidants carried tales between chambers. Foreign envoys, keen to decipher the mysteries of the empire, often misinterpreted gestures or repeated hearsay, amplifying suspicion. In such a setting, an empress's slightest action could be magnified into evidence of a hidden passion. One of the most enduring figures in Byzantine history is Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian the 6th century. Her early life, as described by the historian Procopius in his Secret History, was filled with scandalous anecdotes, accounts of performances, affairs, and rumored debauchery. Whether these stories were true or the product of malice is still debated, but their survival reveals the power of rumor in shaping an empress's legacy. As Justinian's partner in rule, Theodora wielded significant influence, championing religious policies and social reforms. Yet to her detractors, her authority could only be explained by seduction and manipulation. The suggestion of past lovers and forbidden shadows became a way to diminish her political role, even as her name endured as one of the empire's most formidable empresses. Later centuries preserved similar tales. Irene of Athens, who reigned as empress in her own right during the late 8th and early 9th centuries, faced constant scrutiny. Her decision to blind her own son, Constantine VI, to secure sole rule shocked contemporaries, but equally persistent were the whispers of male favorites at court who supposedly swayed her policies. Chroniclers eager to tarnish her reputation did not need proof. The mere idea of a woman ruling without a husband made her a target for insinuation. Suggesting that she was enthralled by secret lovers was a convenient way to explain both her ambition and her independence. To Byzantine sources often blurred the line between political critique and moral accusation. To describe an empress as overly close to a general or advisor was to undermine not only her personal virtue but also her political judgment. The empire's chroniclers, many of them monks, framed such rumors in moral terms, presenting the empress as a cautionary figure who endangered the stability of the realm through her supposed passions. In this way, forbidden love became less a question of desire and more a metaphor for disorder. An empress suspected of intimacy beyond her husband was an empress whose authority was suspect. The court of Constantinople, with its ceremonial richness, also magnified the stakes of rumor. During processions through the hippodrome, the empress was displayed beside the emperor, her attire glittering with jewels that reflected the divine light of the empire. But behind this grandeur lay chambers where politics turned on whispers, and where the boundaries between private and public blurred. To accuse an empress of forbidden love was to strike at the heart of imperial legitimacy, to suggest that the woman who symbolized purity and stability was instead a source of corruption. Foreign observers added to this atmosphere. Western chroniclers, often hostile to Byzantium, delighted in repeating stories of imperial debauchery, casting the court as a place of decadence and intrigue. To them, the Eastern Empire was a realm of mystery, where veiled women and shadowed corridors concealed scandal. Such tales traveled back to Europe, where they shaped the enduring image of Byzantium as an empire of suspicion and sin. Even in the later centuries, when the empire weakened and Constantinople faced threats from Crusaders and Ottomans, the role of empresses continued to attract suspicion. Anna of Savoy, who served as regent in the 14th century, faced criticism for her political alliances, which were recast by rivals as personal attachments. The pattern repeated across time. When an empress wielded power, accusations of intimacy with male favorites were never far behind. The Byzantine stories remind us that the theme of forbidden lovers was not confined to Europe's western kingdoms, but was woven into the political and cultural fabric of the Eastern Mediterranean as well. Here, amid mosaics and hymns, amid the incense-filled air of Hagia Sophia and the echoing chambers of the Great Palace, the empress lived as both symbol and target. Her body, her reputation, and her imagined desires were bound inseparably to the empire's stability. To undermine her was to undermine the emperor himself, and thus the rumor of secret lovers became an enduring weapon in the Byzantine arsenal of intrigue. In this way, the history of Byzantine empresses carries the same shadowed themes seen in England, France, and Spain, but with an added layer of spectacle. Their lives unfolded under the weight of ritual, their every gesture framed by allegory, their reputations vulnerable to chroniclers who wielded words as weapons. The palaces of Constantinople no longer stand in their entirety, but the mosaics that survive, depicting solemn queens in shimmering tesserae, remind us of the paradox. They were at once revered and mistrusted, exalted in ceremony yet diminished by rumor, eternal symbols of sovereignty yet perpetually pursued by the shadows of forbidden love. In the world of monarchies and empires, where a queen's presence carried the weight of dynasties, the shadow of religion fell long and heavy across her life. The Church, in its many forms across Europe and beyond, stood not only as a guardian of souls, but as a judge of conduct, a force that bound together morality and politics in a single web. Queens whose bodies symbolized both dynastic continuity and sacred purity were placed under the sharpest gaze of faith. The confessional box, the pulpit, and the tribunal of ecclesiastical courts became places where whispers of forbidden love were turned into accusations, and accusations were shaped into punishments that could scar a reign or erase a life. From the earliest centuries of Christendom, queens were presented as examples of chastity and virtue, often compared to biblical figures who embodied obedience and faithfulness. To fall short of this ideal, or even to be suspected of falling short, was not simply a personal failing, but a spiritual rupture. Churchmen framed queens as vessels, through which the stability of kingdoms could be either preserved or destroyed. Their vows to their husbands, like the vows of kings to their realms, were seen as sacramental, woven into divine order. Thus, when a queen was accused of straying, the matter was not just of the bedchamber, but of heaven and hell, of salvation and damnation. The mechanisms of religious authority were many. In Catholic Europe, confession was both a spiritual act and a potential weapon. A priest might hear the secrets of a queen's heart, but he also stood within a network that linked conscience to control. Though bound by the seal of confession, the very act reinforced the awareness that every sin, even a whispered one, was known to God, and could be judged by his church. Outside the intimacy of confession, ecclesiastical courts wielded power that stretched into palaces. Adultery, fornication, and scandal were matters that bishops and inquisitors could investigate, often with punishments that blurred the line between moral correction and political theatre. In Protestant lands, where the Reformation had redefined the relationship between church and crown, queens were not spared the shadow of religious judgment. The case of Anne Boleyn in England stands as one of the clearest examples. Her alleged indiscretions, whispered and magnified, were framed not only as betrayals of her husband, Henry VIII, but as offences against the divine order that sanctified marriage. Her trial, though political in substance, was cloaked in religious tones, with her supposed sins presented as a stain upon the sacredness of the English crown. When she was condemned, it was not only as a faithless wife, but as a woman who had offended God by stepping outside the boundaries prescribed for her. The Catholic monarchies of Spain and France carried their own histories of such shadows. In Spain, the Inquisition acted as both a guardian of orthodoxy and a tool of control, ensuring that morality aligned with religious authority. Queens accused of straying into forbidden love risked not only royal disfavor, but the censure of ecclesiastical judgment, which could condemn them to exile, confinement, or lifelong repentance in convent walls. In France, where the Gallican Church balanced its independence with papal allegiance, the pulpit itself often became the place where veiled warnings were delivered. Preachers spoke in allegories that left little doubt about whom they targeted, casting queens as Delilahs or Jezebels, who might endanger not only their husbands but the entire realm. Religion also shaped the rituals of punishment. To send a disgraced queen to a convent was not merely to remove her from political life, but to fold her fate back into the arms of the church. Cloisters became prisons, where the daily rhythm of prayer and silence served as both penance and erasure. In some cases, queens who had been accused of forbidden loves were compelled to wear humble garb, to forego the jewels and silks that once adorned them, as if stripping away their worldly allure could purify their souls. The church provided a vocabulary of repentance that rulers eagerly employed, transforming scandal into morality play, where the queen's downfall confirmed the eternal need for vigilance and virtue. The symbolism extended into death. Funerals of queens who died under the cloud of scandal were often subdued, their memorials stripped of grandeur. Epitaphs, where they existed at all, tended to emphasize humility and penitence rather than majesty. Religious chroniclers, eager to teach lessons, preserved their stories as warnings, using scripture to frame their lives as examples of pride brought low, of passion turned to ruin. And yet, the same faith that judged so harshly also provided moments of defense. Some queens used the language of piety to shield themselves, invoking the Virgin Mary as a model, commissioning chapels and prayers, surrounding themselves with confessors who could testify to their devotion. Religion was a double-edged presence. It could condemn, but it could also protect, offering a vocabulary of sanctity that might counterbalance rumor. Queens who leaned into their role as intercessors, protectors of the poor, and patrons of churches sometimes succeeded in cloaking their reputations in holiness, even as whispers continued behind closed doors. The broader world beyond Europe offered variations on the same theme. In Orthodox lands such as Russia, queens and empresses serenas were also judged within the framework of faith. The church, deeply entwined with the Tacitdom, treated rumors of intimacy as more than personal failings. They were signs of potential spiritual corruption at the heart of power. Similarly, in the Islamic courts of the Ottoman Empire and Persia, where queens and consorts lived within harems shaped by religious law, accusations of forbidden love were framed not only as betrayals of honor, but as transgressions against divine order, punishable under Sharia. Across these regions, the pattern is unmistakable. The intimacy of queens was never merely personal, never merely whispered in corridors. It was elevated, by faith and by the institutions of religion, into a realm of cosmic consequence. To accuse a queen of a forbidden lover was to declare that she had stepped outside God's design, and therefore that the stability of the crown, the dynasty, and the realm itself was under threat. Religion gave the language, the rituals, and the punishments by which such accusations were made real, binding the shadows of queens' desires to the eternal struggle between sin and virtue. Thus, the story of forbidden intimacy cannot be told without the shadow of faith. From the soft echo of prayers in cloisters, to the stern proclamations of church courts, from whispered confessions to public sermons, religion defined not only what it meant to be a faithful queen, but what it meant to fall, and in that fall, history found lessons it repeated again and again, draped in scripture, preserved in sermons, and carved into the slow memory of kingdoms. The medieval castle, so often remembered as a fortress of stone and iron, was also a place of silences and murmurs, its architecture layered with spaces where both power and secrecy found a home. Within its walls, life unfolded in a rhythm that was public and ceremonial in some chambers, private and shadowed in others. Queens, bound by the rigid expectations of visibility and virtue, nonetheless lived in environments that contained alcoves and gardens, galleries and corridors, where glances could linger too long, where footsteps could echo unseen, and where whispers might cling to the cold stone as stubbornly as ivy to a tower wall. The great halls, with their high timbered roofs and echoing feasts, were stages of spectacle, but the life of a queen rarely played out there. Instead, it was in the private chambers, the solar, the bedchamber, the oratory, where the layers of architecture created a tension between display and concealment. The queen's apartments were designed to emphasize proximity to the king, yet they were also protected by an intricate geography of doors, guards, and attendants. To reach her, one passed through multiple thresholds, each one narrowing access, each one watched by servants sworn to vigilance. Yet in this very design of controlled movement lay the possibility of secrecy. Hidden doors, sometimes no more than narrow passages worked into thick walls, allowed access without notice. Galleries overlooked chapels, allowing queens to appear at prayer yet shielded from view, while garden walks enclosed by high stone made conversations inaudible beyond their hedges. Historians of architecture have long noted that castles were not only military fortresses, but also palaces of ritual. The architecture itself reflected the ideals of hierarchy, with public halls below and private apartments above. The very notion of a sola, a chamber for private living bathed in light from tall windows, spoke to a space designed for retreat. Yet in these retreats, stories accumulated. Queens were sometimes accused of lingering too long with favored courtiers in secluded gardens, or of receiving attendants by way of winding passages that bypassed the usual routes. Whether these stories were truth or invention, the physical spaces allowed them to seem plausible, for the architecture made room for secrecy as much as for ceremony. Gardens, in particular, were places where the natural world softened the rigidity of stone. Enclosed by walls or lattices, they were designed for recreation, meditation, and escape. Within them time slowed, the fragrance of herbs mingling with the stillness of fountains, the shuffle of footsteps softened by gravel paths. Chroniclers often described queens in gardens, walking, praying, or reading psalters, but just as often gardens became backdrops in tales of intimacy. To accuse a queen of meeting a forbidden lover among roses and vines was to blend reality with allegory, for gardens themselves carried biblical associations of temptation, from Eden to the Song of Songs. The castles of France with their elaborate keeps and moats, the fortresses of England perched on windswept hills, the palaces of Spain with their blend of Moorish courtyards and Gothic chambers, all carried within them such ambiguities. The same architectural features that demonstrated wealth and power could serve in rumor as conduits of secrecy. A spiral stair might allow a figure to slip unseen. A chapel gallery might allow a queen to meet the gaze of someone below. A window overlooking an inner courtyard might provide the setting for a silent exchange, remembered later as scandal. It was not only the physical architecture that made secrecy possible, but also the architecture of court life itself. Queens were rarely alone. They were surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, chambermaids, guards, and confessors. Yet within this crowd, alliances formed and silences were bought. A trusted attendant might guard a door a little longer than necessary, or turn her gaze aside. The very system designed to ensure visibility could in moments serve to obscure it. Rumors of forbidden love often turned not on dramatic gestures, but on small observations, a glance, a pause in conversation, a meeting not on the grand stairway but in a shaded corridor. The castle's architecture amplified these small acts, holding them in its stone, ready for the chronicler to shape them into stories. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, architecture became even more elaborate. Palaces replaced stark fortresses, and with them came an increase in private chambers and discreet routes of access. Italian courts with their loggias and frescoed apartments created spaces where art and allegory blurred the line between virtue and temptation. In France, the Loire Valley Château, though outwardly open and adorned with windows, contained networks of rooms that allowed both surveillance and seclusion. In England, Hampton Court's labyrinth of chambers made encounters both more controlled and more suspect, for every turn of the corridor invited the question who else might be there unseen. The whispering walls of castles were thus more than a metaphor. They were participants in the life of queens, silent witnesses to the tension between visibility and concealment. Whether or not forbidden loves actually unfolded within their chambers, the architecture gave shape to the possibility. Chroniclers and poets seized on these possibilities, weaving them into narratives where the queen's virtue was either defended or condemned, always against the backdrop of stone walls that seemed to keep their own counsel. And today, as tourists walk through these ruins or preserved palaces, the stones still hold an air of secrecy. Narrow staircases, unexpected alcoves, and hidden doors spark the imagination, suggesting that the past was filled with moments unseen, conversations unheard, shadows that may have lingered where light barely reached. The architecture of secrecy remains, even when the lives it once contained have long since passed, leaving behind only the suggestion that the walls themselves remember. Among the many tales of queens drawn into the web of rumor and accusation, there exists a quieter but no less compelling thread. Those women who, rather than being undone by whispers, managed to endure, outlast, and even transform suspicion into power. The history of monarchy is filled with examples of downfall, beheadings, imprisonments, and enforced exiles. Yet scattered among these tragedies are figures who demonstrated resilience. Their ability to navigate scandal without surrendering to it reshaped not only their personal legacies, but also the very expectations of queenship. They remind us that survival was possible, even when shadows pressed close. One of the most striking figures is Eleanor of Aquitaine, a queen whose life traversed France and England in the 12th century. She was no stranger to whispers, her independence and strong will drawing constant suspicion. Chroniclers hinted at inappropriate intimacies during her marriage to Louis VII of France, particularly when she joined him on the Second Crusade, and spent long stretches in the company of her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers. Rumor insisted that their relationship had crossed into the forbidden, though evidence remains elusive. What mattered was perception, and perception grew damning enough that her marriage to Louis collapsed. Yet, Eleanor did not fade into obscurity. Instead, she remarried, this time to Henry II of England, and became the matriarch of one of the most influential dynasties in European history. The very qualities that had made her suspect, her confidence, her independence, her ability to forge alliances, became tools of power, ensuring that her legacy was one of strength rather than scandal. Another queen who emerged from shadow was Catherine de' Medici of France. As an Italian-born outsider, married into the French crown in the 16th century, she was a figure of suspicion from the beginning. Rumors swirled around her court, tales of poisonings, of secret lovers, of manipulations carried out in moonlit corridors. She was painted by her enemies as a schemer who corrupted the purity of France, and yet she survived through sheer political acumen. When her husband Henry II died, Catherine became regent for her young sons, guiding France through the wars of religion. The whispers of scandal never entirely disappeared, but she turned them into armor. The image of the dangerous shadowed queen became a form of power, allowing her to dominate court politics and maintain her family's grip on the throne in one of Europe's most tumultuous eras. In Spain, Isabella of Castile faced her own share of suspicion. though of a different nature. As a queen who ruled jointly with Ferdinand of Aragon, she was subject to the constant question of how much influence she truly wielded. Whispers of inappropriate closeness to advisors or confessors occasionally shadowed her, as they did most queens who broke the boundaries of expected passivity. Yet, Isabella navigated these murmurs carefully, presenting herself as a model of piety and devotion. She built her image upon faith, aligning herself so strongly with Catholic reform and the Reconquista that accusations of intimacy with forbidden figures could not gain lasting traction. In her case, survival came not through confrontation, but through embodiment of the very ideals that the church and state demanded, turning her into a figure who seemed almost untouchable. Other queens endured by transforming their personal narratives into symbols of cultural power. Marguerite of Navarre, though never Queen of France in her own right, occupied a position of prominence in the 16th century as the sister of Francis I and consort of Henry II of Navarre. She lived amid constant rumors, particularly because of her patronage of writers and thinkers who pushed against religious orthodoxy. Whispers suggested that her intimacy with poets and scholars crossed boundaries, yet Marguerite harnessed the scandalous aura to her advantage. She cultivated an image of intellectual queenly authority, her literary works, including the Heptameron, ensuring that she was remembered as a patron of the Renaissance rather than a victim of gossip. By embracing the whispers, she deflected them, making her presence at court indispensable. Even in England, where the fate of queens was often particularly harsh, survival was possible. Elizabeth Woodville, consort of Edward IV, faced accusations of witchcraft and rumors of secret alliances. Her sudden marriage to the king, outside of the usual dynastic arrangements, stirred suspicion that she had entrapped him through sorcery or seduction. Rivals painted her as a dangerous figure, and her family's rise to prominence became the target of resentment. Yet Elizabeth survived multiple shifts of fortune, outliving her husband and even the deposition of her son Edward IV. Though briefly confined, she emerged with her dignity intact, remembered as the mother of the Tudor line through her daughter Elizabeth of York. What might have been ruin was instead transformed into legacy. The shadow turned into continuity. The survival of these queens was never simple. It required careful navigation of politics, faith, and image. They could not banish rumors outright, for whispers once spoken could not be erased. Instead, they learned to redirect them, to build public personas that absorbed suspicion and turned it into a demonstration of resilience. Some embraced piety, others wielded cunning, others leaned into their roles as patrons of culture and family. In each case, the queen who endured revealed the fragile line between scandal and strength, between destruction and survival. Their stories suggest that forbidden shadows, though dangerous, did not always consume. Sometimes they offered opportunities, forcing queens to act, to shape their identities in ways that made them unforgettable. The walls of castles and the pens of chroniclers may have conspired to bring them down, but through adaptability and endurance, they emerged not only intact but powerful. The very rumors that once threatened to destroy them became part of the mythos that ensured their memory, and so the history of queens who escaped the shadows becomes not one of silence but of transformation. In their lives we see how scandal could be turned into strength, how accusation could be endured, and how survival itself became a form of victory. Their stories remind us that power is not only in triumph but also in endurance, in the quiet act of outlasting both rumor and time. History is never still. It shifts and bends, retold by each generation not only according to what was known but also according to what was needed. The stories of queens and their supposed forbidden shadows did not remain fixed within the lifetimes of the women themselves. Instead, they became fluid, reshaped by chroniclers, monks, poets, and later historians, each one layering their own perspective upon a fragile foundation of rumor. In this way, the memory of scandal became a kind of echo chamber. What may have been little more than a passing whisper at court could, in the hands of later writers, grow into an enduring tale of passion and betrayal, a myth that overshadowed even the real political achievements of the queen herself. The medieval chronicler was often the first to decide how a queen would be remembered. Many such writers were monks, men for whom celibacy was the lens through which all desire was judged. For them, queens accused of intimacy outside their marriages were cautionary figures, examples of Eve's weakness reborn in palaces of stone. Their chronicles did not simply describe events, they moralized, shaping narratives into warnings for rulers and subjects alike. Eleanor of Aquitaine's supposed intimacy with her uncle during the Crusades may have been no more than gossip, but chroniclers, eager to explain the failure of the campaign, made it into a central episode, linking personal rumor with political disaster. The memory of her reign was thus indelibly tied to a story that magnified her sexuality, while minimizing her political acumen. As centuries passed, new generations inherited these accounts, and often added embellishments. In the Renaissance, when interest in classical allegory mingled with fascination for royal courts, queens were often cast as tragic heroines or dangerous seductresses in plays and poetry. Isabella of France, accused of conspiring with Roger Mortimer against Edward II, was recast in later memory as the She-Wolf of France, a title that distilled her life into an image of ruthless passion. The epithet did not originate in her own time but arose centuries later, reflecting how memory prefers symbols over nuance. Once written, it became nearly impossible to erase, even as modern historians attempt to disentangle the political realities from the shadows of exaggeration. The 18th and 19th centuries further transformed these stories, fueled by the rise of popular history and romantic literature. Marie Antoinette, whose real life was shaped by political constraints and the looming shadow of revolution, became in memory the embodiment of frivolity and excess. Pamphlets of her time had already accused her of a dizzying array of forbidden encounters, both heterosexual and homosexual, with courtiers, guards, and even her sister-in-law. Later generations, steeped in the drama of her downfall, repeated these tales without question, cementing them into the collective imagination. The image of Marie Antoinette as a queen lost to shadows, no matter how exaggerated, became more enduring than her efforts at charity, diplomacy, or reform. The memory of shadows was also subject to deliberate erasure. Queens who were particularly beloved, or whose dynasties wished to preserve a spotless image, often had their scandals quietly removed from official chronicles. Records were destroyed, paintings altered, names struck from genealogies. In Spain, where the Inquisition maintained rigid control over morality, stories of queens accused of intimacy with forbidden lovers were often silenced altogether. The absence itself became a kind of presence, for the lack of detail in some reigns suggests that rumors may have once existed, only to be wiped away in service of dynastic purity. The silence is as telling as the exaggeration, a reminder that memory is not only what survives, but also what is made to disappear. National identity, too, shaped memory. In Russia, tales of empresses accused of lovers, particularly Catherine the Great, were exaggerated to grotesque proportions by foreign enemies who sought to humiliate the empire. The infamous and false story of Catherine's supposed death during intimacy with a horse originated not within Russia, but among detractors abroad, eager to reduce a powerful female ruler to an object of ridicule. The persistence of this story into modern times demonstrates how rumor, once unleashed, can live independently of truth, becoming a permanent stain upon memory even when thoroughly disproven. Modern historians, armed with archives and critical methods, have sought to peel away these layers, to recover the real queens from beneath the exaggerations. Yet even as careful scholarship reclaims Eleanor as a political strategist, Isabella of France as a ruler in her own right, or Marie Antoinette as a victim of propaganda, the old shadows continue to haunt popular imagination. Novels, films, and television series often choose scandal over subtlety, for the forbidden love of a queen makes for more compelling drama than the intricacies of law codes, alliances, or taxation. Thus, the memory of shadows persists, because it serves the purposes of storytelling in every age. This process of retelling reflects not only on queens themselves but on the societies that remember them. In ages of moral rigidity, their rumored lovers are framed as sins. In times of romanticism, they are cast as tragic passions. In modern retellings, they are sometimes even reclaimed as acts of resistance, queens portrayed as women who broke oppressive boundaries. The same story, filtered through centuries, changes shape to match the concerns of each generation, like a shadow stretching long or short, depending on the angle of the sun. And so the memory of queens' forbidden shadows remains an ongoing narrative, never still, never wholly erased. Their reputations are mosaics assembled by many hands, some hostile, some sympathetic, all reshaping truth into story. What lingers is not certainty but atmosphere, a sense that behind the stone walls and gilded chambers of the past, secrets moved like smoke, unseen, ungraspable, but always remembered. The passage of time does not diminish the allure of forbidden stories. If anything, it sharpens them, polishing rumor into legend, and legend into a tale retold across centuries. As the 19th and 20th centuries unfolded, the memory of queens who walked with shadows did not fade into obscurity. Instead, it found new breath in novels, plays, films, and eventually television series that translated the whispers of chroniclers into images, dialogues, and staged encounters. In this transformation, the queens themselves were remade for new audiences, their supposed affairs reframed not as scandals alone, but as spectacles of passion, tragedy, and rebellion. The Victorian era was particularly fertile ground for the romanticization of queens' forbidden loves. Historical novels became a popular genre, offering readers the chance to enter into imagined palaces where passion stirred beneath heavy tapestries. Eleanor of Aquitaine, once remembered primarily as a political player, was recast in novels as a woman whose heart ruled over her duty. Her supposed romances with troubadours, brought to life in lush, idealized prose. In this retelling, what had once been a whisper of scandal became a celebrated symbol of vitality, allowing readers to indulge in stories of queens who defied kings not only in politics, but in the secrecy of their chambers. The rise of theatre brought another transformation. Playwrights, drawn to the tension between public duty and private desire, found in these stories the perfect balance of grandeur and intimacy. Isabella of France's relationship with Roger Mortimer, for instance, was dramatized not as mere treachery but as a tragic romance doomed by the weight of power. The stage allowed audiences to glimpse a queen not as a political figure alone, but as a woman torn by longing, a reinterpretation that softened the harsher judgments of medieval chroniclers. What had once been condemned as betrayal was, by the 19th century, staged as a heartbreaking inevitability. Film in the 20th century magnified these retellings. Marie Antoinette, whose historical life had already been overlaid with centuries of gossip, became a cinematic icon of desire and downfall. Early silent films portrayed her as a frivolous seductress, while later works such as those of Hollywood in the 1930s and 1950s emphasized her vulnerability, her supposed affairs reframed as the desperate gestures of a young woman trapped in a rigid and hostile court. In the 21st century, Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette presented her with an entirely modern sensibility, surrounded by fashion, music, and youthful longing, where the rumors of intimacy with courtiers and friends were not condemned but presented as part of her humanity. Catherine the Great too became the subject of endless reinvention. The infamous false legend of her death, born of foreign mockery, lingered in popular imagination, but plays and later television dramas shifted the focus to her lovers as symbols of her autonomy. In modern retellings, her choices in intimacy were no longer viewed as sins but as assertions of independence against a patriarchal order. Here, forbidden love was recast as political defiance, a shadow transformed into light, a narrative that resonated strongly in eras that celebrated female empowerment. Even queens whose shadows were faint in historical record found new life in literature. Novelists of the 20th century, freed from the rigid expectations of earlier scholarship, allowed themselves to imagine what might have been, filling the silences of chronicles with whispered possibilities. Scandinavian queens, Byzantine empresses, Mughal consorts, all became subjects of fiction where romance could flourish in the gaps left by history. What the chroniclers had erased, novelists restored, not necessarily as truth but as a form of narrative justice, giving voice to the shadows that had been denied. Television, with its long form, brought these tales into the homes of millions, extending their reach. Series such as The Tudors dramatized Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard with heavy emphasis on desire, jealousy, and forbidden encounters. What the executioner's blade had silenced in the 16th century, television restored with lingering glances, whispered meetings, and secret embraces. The queens were no longer symbols of betrayal alone, but complex figures in whom desire, ambition, and fragility intertwined. Audiences, accustomed to both spectacle and intimacy, found in these retellings a mirror for their own questions about love, power, and secrecy. The modern retellings thus served not merely to entertain but also to reshape memory. Where medieval chroniclers had condemned, and Renaissance poets had moralized, contemporary dramatists often celebrated, or at least humanized. The queens were shown as victims of circumstance, of patriarchal rule, of political machinery, larger than themselves. Their forbidden loves became not cautionary tales, but narratives of survival and agency. Even the architecture of secrecy, the hidden passage, the secluded garden, became a setting for cinematic beauty, places where audiences could imagine that within the rigid world of duty, love still found a way to breathe, and yet the shadows remained. For while these retellings softened or celebrated the forbidden, they also perpetuated the central fascination. The queen caught between the throne and the embrace of one who was not the king. This image, endlessly adaptable, remained irresistible, because it carried within it the eternal tension of human life, the pull between what is expected and what is desired. Modern audiences, no less than medieval peasants or Renaissance readers, leaned forward to listen, to watch, to believe that behind the gilded doors, something both forbidden and deeply human unfolded. In this way, the modern retellings kept the queens alive, not as distant figures of history, but as enduring presences in cultural memory. Their shadows moved across stages, screens, and pages, reinterpreted again and again because each age required them anew. The queens themselves had long since gone to dust, but their rumored loves lived on, transformed into myth, symbol, and story, never still, always whispering. The story of queens and their shadows does not conclude with any single reign, trial, or execution. It lingers across centuries, drifting like candle smoke in forgotten chambers, persisting not because of what truly happened, but because of what humanity continues to imagine. The fascination is endless, for in every age, people have looked back at these women and seen more than their crowns, their treaties, or their dynasties. They have seen the possibility that within the most guarded palaces, within the most rigid duties, lay hidden desires that even kings could not fully control. The appeal rests in the contradiction. Queens stood as embodiments of majesty and order, their lives carefully framed by ceremony and ritual. Yet rumors of secret intimacy, whether true or false, suggested that they too were fragile, their humanity breaking through the weight of duty. To imagine a queen walking into the arms of someone other than her husband, was to imagine that power itself could be bent by longing, that even the throne was not immune to the quiet insistence of desire. It was a thought both scandalous and strangely comforting, because it humanized what otherwise seemed untouchable. At the same time, the fascination has always carried an edge of defiance. Queens accused of forbidden affairs, whether guilty or innocent, represented a subtle challenge to the structures that confined them. In medieval Europe, a queen's body was a vessel for dynastic legitimacy. In the Ottoman world, a consort's fidelity was guarded as an extension of imperial honor. In Russia, the empress's lovers were scrutinized as symbols of political influence. To imagine intimacy beyond the king's reach was to imagine a breach in the fortress of authority, a moment when private longing threatened public order. The shadow became more than gossip. It became a metaphor for rebellion against the systems that demanded silence, purity, and obedience. The fascination is also sustained by the very nature of rumor. Forbidden love thrives in secrecy, in the spaces between what is known and what can never be proven. Chroniclers wrote half-truths, poets embellished allegories, pamphleteers spread scandal, and filmmakers added color and sound. Each retelling drew from shadows rather than certainties, and it is precisely the lack of clarity that makes these stories endure. Where there is no final truth, imagination is free to roam. The endless fascination lives in the silences of history, where one may picture whispered meetings in gardens, furtive glances across banquet halls, or footsteps in hidden corridors, even if such moments never truly occurred. In the end, queens remembered through their supposed lovers become symbols of duality. They are fragile, because their reputations could be undone by a single rumor. But they are also defiant, because in memory their shadows suggest lives larger than the cages of power around them. They embody both vulnerability and resistance, both the inevitability of scandal and the possibility of freedom. And so, century after century, audiences return to them, in chronicles, in novels, in plays, in films, not to resolve the truth, but to linger in the uncertainty. The fascination with queens who slept with forbidden shadows is perhaps less about the queens themselves and more about humanity's own enduring curiosity. It reflects a need to believe that power and desire are forever intertwined, that even behind the most fortified walls there are secrets untold, and that in the shadows of history, one can always find a story that is both intimate and immense. The queens, long buried, remain alive in this endless retelling, not as they truly were, but as symbols of the fragile, defiant and unquenchable human heart.